On Friday, Congressman Hensarling is the vice-ranking member of the House Budget Committee and joins us now from Dallas. How are you doing this morning, sir?
I'm doing good. How are y'all?
Hey, so, Congressman, the president says you weren't telling the truth.
Well, either the president misunderstood the point or he just hasn't been well informed. If you look at the 12 years when Republicans controlled the Congress, the average annual deficit was about $104 billion. I'm not proud of that number. That's too high. But in the 3 years that Democrats have controlled Congress, the average annual deficit is now $1.1 trillion. Do the math. What used to be an annual deficit under Republicans has become a monthly deficit under Democrats. And so when the president says, I inherited a big deficit, I agree, but he inherited it from a Democratic Congress, and only Congress can spend the money. That's the point I was making, and if you would allow me, here's the chart. You can go to the Congressional Budget Office website, you can go to the Office of Management and Budget, and it will prove the same point. So perhaps the president misunderstood the context, but facts are facts, and maybe that's why he wasn't too happy with it.
Well, Jeff, those are the facts, but at the same time, obviously President Bush and Republicans in Congress from 2001 through 2006 put this country on a spending trajectory that was unsustainable. I mean, my God, I was warning about big Republican deficits in 2004. I mean, you do understand Republicans have a big role to play in this mess.
Oh, listen, I haven't denied it, and I've introduced legislation that would reform our budget process and cap the growth of government at the growth of the economy. Listen, I'm not here to say Republicans are blameless,
right?
But when it comes to spending, debts, and deficits, we're rank amateurs compared to these guys. And the bottom line is this is a serious problem for the country. We're on the verge of being the first generation to leave the next generation with a lower standard of living. We're seeing debts and deficits just unparalleled in American history. You have to go back to World War II to see this, and it's one of the things that's hampering our job growth.
Right.
Okay.
Doesn't it make sense,
yes,
though, Congressman, to run a deficit when you're fighting a war or when the country's experiencing economic problems? So doesn't it just, and we're doing both right now, so doesn't that just make sense that we need to spend a little bit more money to get back on our feet and to win wars?
Well, the President and the Congress just put forth a $1.2 trillion stimulus plan, and almost a year later, we're still mired in double-digit unemployment, and all we have is debt. I mean, you cannot borrow, spend, and bail out your way into economic prosperity.
But the economy's recovering.
Helpful is
Isn't the economy recovering?
I don't know how you can slosh around some, no jobs, no recovery. I'm happy to see the GDP numbers, and I don't understand how you can slosh around so much money, borrowing it from the future, bringing it into the present, and not have an impact on GDP, so I'm glad to see that. But if it's working, then I guess it begs the question, why does the president want yet another stimulus plan? I lose track. This is either Stimulus 3 or Stimulus 4 when you throw in the whole government omnibus plan. I personally don't think it's working, and small businesses are wondering, how are we going to pay for this debt? And so that's one of the reasons that job growth is inhibited.
And thank you. I think the president's point, though, about Republicans is well taken, especially when you had a handful of Republicans against a deficit freeze. But let me ask you this, Joe. Where do we draw the line on spending? Where should this president draw the line, given what Andy laid out, which I think was a legitimate point?
Really, that's a problem. Of course, Andy, nobody's suggesting that we don't spend when we're in the type of recession that we're in. We have 10% unemployment. But when the President of the United States adds $100 to $150 billion on top of a deficit, as we found out this morning in the New York Times he was going to do, it's just in spending, just sort of like an afterthought. Oh, by the way, here's another $100 to $150 billion. That is a total amount, picking up on what Jeb said, of Ronald Reagan's deficits. We hear every time I try to talk about deficits, and that's all I've been talking about since 1994. Democrats will say, well, Ronald Reagan started this mess, and you Republican. Well, Ronald Reagan's total deficits were the size of an afterthought this morning by Barack Obama. I'm not saying we need to be Herbert Hoover. I'm not saying that we need to go on a deep spending freeze for a decade to come. But my God, there has to be some.
Well, those numbers,
perspective.
were 20 years ago, though, too, right? So, I mean, adjusted for inflation and the size of the economy.
We are still at 11% of GDP.
That's the number.
And Congressman, we're still on an unsustainable course. I want you to tell me, how can you assure me, as a small government conservative, that if Republicans are put in charge again after 2010's elections, that Republicans aren't going to do the same thing over the next 2 years that they did from 2001 to 2006? Because when I left Congress, we had a $155 billion surplus. When Democrats got in control, we were up to about a $500 billion deficit.
Well, first, one of the reasons Republicans were thrown out is because we didn't live up to our commitment to fiscal responsibility. If we don't do it again, throw us out. But we've put a budget on the table under Congressman Paul Ryan of Wisconsin that would keep the government growth at its historic levels, that would reform our entitlement programs and make good on our word. You can see the budget.
All right, Representative Jeb Hensarling, thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. By the way, Paul Ryan is a real star in this Congress. He really is.